General Thrazik had never wanted to return to the front lines. His days of battle, blood, and fire had long since passed. He had earned his retirement years ago, having fought in wars across galaxies, securing his place as one of the most celebrated war veterans in his species' history. However, those same hard-won accolades were now the very reason he found himself on the training grounds of the alien military once again. The military high command had insisted. The new recruits, a young and eager group of alien soldiers, were incapable of being molded into proper warriors without Thrazik's expertise. But as the general looked at the sea of faces before him, some youthful and others just eager to prove themselves, he couldn't help but feel a bitter sense of doubt. The world had changed. These soldiers had never seen the brutalities of war as he had, and their advanced technologies and sleek armors had made them soft. They were untested in ways that mattered. Despite his reservations, Thrazik stood tall, his sharp eyes scanning the recruits. Some looked at him with awe, others with skepticism. They had no idea what kind of battles he had faced in his youth, what kind of horrors he had survived, and how much he had learned from a species they considered primitive. Earth. The Deathworld. Thrazik snorted to himself at the thought. He never intended to teach them about Earth, about humans, but necessity had dictated otherwise. And so, he found himself on a training field surrounded by beings who couldn't fathom how dangerous Earth truly was. He didn't start with weapons drills. He didn't begin with advanced tactics or strategies. Instead, he made them sit. He learned long ago that the mind was just as important, if not more, than the body when it came to survival. "You've been given all this," Thrazik began, gesturing to the sleek armaments and energy shields at their sides. "But none of it means anything if you can't think your way out of a problem." He paused, watching their faces for signs of comprehension, or the lack thereof. "The humans of Earth don't have your technology, but they are the most resilient species I have ever encountered. They live on a planet full of dangers that would destroy most other species." Thrazik's voice was low, carrying the weight of his personal experience. "It's called a Deathworld. I fought beside a human named Captain Marcus Kane. It was through his bravery, wit, and sheer will that we survived. You would do well to remember his lessons, because they will serve you better than any weapon or armor." The soldiers exchanged confused glances. They had heard rumors of this human, but none had believed them. How could a species, so seemingly fragile, survive in the brutal environment of a planet like Earth? They viewed humans with a mix of condescension and fascination, assuming that Thrazik's reverence for them was nothing more than nostalgia. "General, forgive me," one soldier spoke up, raising a hand. "But how can a species with no advanced technology survive the dangers of their planet? Surely, they must have some form of aid. No species could survive without it." Thrazik's lips curled into a faint smile. "You're right. Humans do have one thing that allows them to survive: adaptability. That, more than anything, is what makes them so dangerous." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The soldiers seemed unmoved, still unconvinced by the outlandishness of it all. Thrazik's eyes narrowed, his gaze locking onto the youngest of the recruits. Cadet Rill. The eager soldier who had been whispering questions about Earth since the moment they were introduced. "Tell me, Cadet," Thrazik said, "what happens when you're faced with an enemy you can't overpower? Or when you're stuck in an environment that wants to kill you at every turn?" Rill hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "You fight, General. You fight until you win." Thrazik shook his head. "No. You adapt. You think. You survive. And that is something no weapon or machine can teach you. It comes from within." The recruits were silent. They had no real understanding of what Thrazik was talking about. He knew that. He also knew that this was the part of the lesson that would take the longest to sink in. "So, General," one of the older soldiers ventured, "this human, Marcus Kane, is he truly the key to your survival?" Thrazik's eyes softened at the mention of Marcus. He had not spoken about his old comrade in years, not since they parted ways. "Yes," Thrazik said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. Marcus taught me how to survive when everything seemed hopeless. His planet was a battlefield every single day. And every day, he found a way to survive, whether it was by outsmarting a predator or using the environment to his advantage. I learned from him how to think like a human. For a moment, the recruits fell into silence, processing this new information. The idea of Earth being a death world was difficult to grasp, and the idea of humans being superior not in strength, but in their ability to survive against overwhelming odds, was even harder to accept. But Thrazik knew this was only the beginning. He would have to show them. He would have to tell them more of Marcus's stories to make them believe, to make them understand that survival was not about sheer strength, it was about creativity, quick thinking, and adaptability. With a deep breath, Thrazik began his first tale, recounting the time Marcus had single-handedly outwitted a group of alien creatures that were notorious for their intelligence and lethal agility. These creatures, native to Earth's dense forests, could kill in seconds. Yet Marcus, with nothing but his wits and the environment around him, had managed to trap them and turn their own hunting instincts against them. As Thrazik spoke, his voice low and steady, he watched the recruits' expressions shift. Some were still skeptical, but others were beginning to look at him with curiosity. It was clear that they didn't yet understand the gravity of his words, but he could see the flickers of doubt beginning to fade. The story continued, each word adding another layer to the myth of Marcus Kane and the human death world. Thrazik saw his recruits slowly begin to believe. They were still young, still impressionable, and that made them malleable. He only hoped that they could learn what he had learned, that true warriors didn't rely on weapons, they relied on their minds, their will, and their ability to adapt. And so, the tales continued, each one more unbelievable than the last. As the day went on, Thrazik could sense the change in the air. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The seed had been planted. It would take time for the recruits to truly understand the lessons of Earth. But by the end of the day, Thrazik was certain of one thing. The humans had already taught him more about survival than any alien technology ever could. Thrazik's stories had a profound effect on the recruits. The young soldiers, who had once viewed Earth as a trivial, primitive planet, were now beginning to understand the kind of survival it demanded. But as the days passed, their skepticism lingered. No matter how thrilling Thrazik's stories were, they couldn't shake their disbelief. They had been trained to view warfare through the lens of advanced technology and brute force, not resourcefulness. They couldn't yet grasp how the tales of Marcus Kane, a human, had anything to do with their training. The first story that truly captured the recruits' attention was one where Marcus had survived a brutal attack from a massive, predator-like creature native to Earth. The creature, a colossal beast covered in thick scales, had ambushed Marcus while he was alone in a dense jungle. With no weapons, no backup, and only his wits to rely on, Marcus had used the surrounding environment to outmaneuver the beast. He had led the creature into a trap by exploiting its one weakness, the beast's inability to see in the dark. As the creature lunged, Marcus used the shadows of the jungle and the tall foliage to his advantage, evading the creature's powerful claws and teeth. In the end, Marcus had blinded the creature temporarily by setting a fire, using the smoke to confuse and overwhelm it. Thrazik watched his recruits carefully as he recounted the details. They sat in stunned silence, absorbing the sheer ingenuity of Marcus's actions. The concept of using the environment as a weapon was not foreign to them, but they had always relied on specialized technology to augment their strength. They couldn't fathom surviving by outsmarting an enemy rather than overpowering it. Survival is not just about overpowering your opponent, Thrazik said, his voice steady. It's about using what's around you, what you have, to your advantage. Marcus didn't have a weapon. He had the jungle. And he used it to turn the tables. A recruit, one of the older soldiers, raised his hand. General, you say Marcus used the jungle to trap the creature. But what if he had no fire? What if the jungle didn't offer him that advantage? Thrazik nodded thoughtfully, knowing this would come up. Marcus would have adapted. There's always something to use. That's the key. It's not about relying on one thing. It's about being ready for anything, and having the presence of mind to act when the situation changes. The recruits were quiet for a moment, processing this. They understood the theory of it, but it was hard for them to internalize the idea that a human, with none of their advanced technology, could survive in such conditions. Then came the second story, a different kind of battle, one that spoke not to physical survival but mental toughness. Thrazik spoke of a time when Marcus had been trapped in a cave system with no food, water, or communication. For days he had wandered through the dark, navigating through treacherous tunnels filled with shifting rocks and dangerous creatures. The most daunting part wasn't the physical dangers, but the isolation. Marcus was utterly alone, cut off from everything. He had no communication devices, no allies, no backup. Just his mind and sheer will to survive. It was during these days that Marcus discovered the true strength of human resilience. Thrazik described how Marcus had pushed through hunger and exhaustion, focusing on his training and mental discipline to keep his fear at bay. The recruits were entranced by this story. They had never known isolation like that. In their experience, there was always backup, always reinforcements, and always the security of technology. The idea of enduring extreme conditions alone without any hope of rescue was foreign to them. Thrazik's voice softened as he recounted the last part of the story. It wasn't just physical strength that kept Marcus going. It was his mind. It was his belief that he could survive. And that belief was enough to keep him moving forward. The recruits sat in stunned silence. To them, the concept of relying on mental strength instead of advanced technology or brute force was hard to grasp. They had been trained to depend on their gadgets, their weapons, and their armor. The notion of pushing through mental barriers in the face of overwhelming odds was entirely new to them. Thrazik could see their doubts begin to waver, but there was still a long way to go. He continued with another story, this one about Marcus's ability to navigate the most hostile environments with nothing but instinct. The story was about a time when Marcus had been sent to retrieve a crucial intelligence file deep within a hostile zone. It was a dangerous mission, with highly armed and tactical enemies stationed all around, and yet Marcus had completed it without firing a single shot. Instead, Marcus had used the terrain to stay hidden and outsmart the enemy. He had crawled through subterranean tunnels, used the natural layout of the land to mislead his enemies, and even used the weather to mask his movements. The whole operation had been a masterpiece of strategic thinking and patience. This is how you survive in a war, not by rushing in with weapons blazing, but by thinking ahead, Thrazik said, looking at each of the recruits with intensity. If Marcus had rushed in, he would have been killed. But instead, he thought about every step, every possibility. He used everything he had, the land, the weather, the enemy's assumptions. And in the end, he walked out without a single casualty on his side. One of the recruits, a young female soldier named Livier, raised her hand. But what if the enemy had better equipment? What if Marcus couldn't hide himself well enough? She asked. Thrazik nodded, anticipating this question. That's the point, Livier. When you're outmatched, you have to outthink your enemy. You can't rely on superior firepower. You have to be smarter. The recruits fell into a thoughtful silence. Thrazik could see the gears turning in their heads. They were beginning to understand. They were starting to see the value of Marcus's approach to warfare. It wasn't about brute strength. It was about using the mind to find ways around problems, to turn disadvantages into opportunities. As the days passed, Thrazik continued to share more of Marcus's stories. He spoke of how Marcus had used the very ecosystem of Earth to his advantage, how he had created traps to catch food, how he had manipulated the weather to survive, how he had even used seemingly mundane objects to make tools that could save his life. Each story painted a new picture for the recruits, one where survival was not guaranteed by strength alone, but by resourcefulness, quick thinking, and the willingness to adapt. The recruits began to take to these lessons, incorporating them into their training. Thrazik had seen this change before, how the toughest soldiers could be molded into the best warriors through adaptability. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about thinking, learning, and evolving. But still, one soldier remained unconvinced, Cadet Rill. His eyes, always sharp and full of ambition, had shown little sign of belief in the tales. He respected Thrazik, but he had never fully bought into the concept of Earth being as dangerous as the general claimed. To Rill, Earth was still just another story, something that couldn't possibly hold up against the firepower and technology of his world. Cadet Rill had always been one to question authority, especially when that authority was Thrazik. While the other recruits seemed to buy into the general's stories, hanging on every word he said, Rill remained skeptical. Earth, as Thrazik had described it, sounded more like a myth than a reality. A planet filled with dangers that would obliterate most other species? It didn't seem possible. How could a species like humans, so physically weak compared to the mighty aliens of the galaxy, survive in such an environment? Rill had heard the tales, but they felt like exaggerated fiction, crafted to make the human race seem more formidable than it really was. But there was something about those stories that gnawed at Rill. Thrazik spoke with such conviction, with such admiration for Marcus Kane, the human who had taught him the art of survival. Every tale from the general had a certain weight to it, a sense of realness that Rill couldn't quite shake. There was something important in those stories, something that didn't add up, and that uncertainty ate at him. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't just let it go. He had to know the truth. He began digging into Earth's history, using the limited resources available to him. He scoured old military records and data archives, looking for any reference to the human species and their supposed Deathworld. Most of it was mundane, reports of human exploration, diplomatic missions, and even some minor skirmishes with other species, but nothing that truly explained how humans survived in the hostile conditions Thrazik had described. That's when he stumbled upon something odd, a distress signal, faint but persistent, originating from a location deep within Earth's atmosphere. The signal had been sent years ago and had never been addressed, likely because it was considered irrelevant by the higher authorities. Rill's heart raced. This was it. This was his chance to find out if Earth was really the death trap Thrazik had described. He had to investigate. He had to know if the general's tales were true or if he had been deceived all along. Driven by a mix of curiosity and a need to prove himself, Rill decided to act on his findings. He gathered a small group of soldiers, those who, like him, had doubts about Thrazik's teachings. They were hesitant at first, but Rill's persuasive arguments convinced them. They would steal a ship and travel to Earth, find the source of the distress signal, and uncover the truth behind the Deathworld. It was risky, of course, but they were soldiers. Risks were part of the job. The group was small, just 5 soldiers, including Rill. They didn't have the resources or clearance to operate at full capacity, so they had to make do with what they could find. The ship they took was a small scout vessel, not much more than a transport craft, but it would be enough to reach Earth undetected. As they prepared to leave, Rill felt a rush of adrenaline, excitement mixing with the fear of the unknown. They were heading into dangerous territory, but this was his chance to uncover the truth. If Thrazik's stories were real, it would be more than a simple military mission, it would be an eye-opening adventure that could change everything. The journey to Earth was long and tense. They had to travel under the radar, avoiding patrols and navigating through a patchwork of galaxies. Rill spent most of the journey in silence, studying the data on Earth that he had gathered, trying to make sense of it all. The planet's atmosphere was inhospitable, and the surface was riddled with natural disasters, volcanic activity, and extreme weather patterns. It didn't make sense that a species like humans could not only survive, but thrive in such an environment. The more he read, the more the question gnawed at him: what was the secret behind this so-called Death World? When they finally arrived at Earth's orbit, Rill and his crew were greeted by a sight that made their stomachs twist. The planet was everything Thrazik had described, and more. Violent storms raged across vast swathes of the planet, towering lightning storms arced across the skies, and volcanic eruptions sent plumes of ash high into the atmosphere. The land below was jagged and broken, scarred by millennia of natural destruction. They were looking at a world that seemed on the brink of collapse, a world that seemed almost hostile to life. Rill's heart pounded in his chest. This was the Deathworld Thrazik had spoken of. There was no denying it now. But what really threw Rill off balance was the realization that, despite the planet's inhospitable conditions, there was life here. Humans. A species that had managed to survive, and even build civilizations, in the midst of chaos. The crew descended to the planet's surface, carefully avoiding the worst of the storms and hazardous terrain. They landed near an old, almost forgotten military outpost, its structure battered by the elements, but still standing strong. The distress signal had originated from here, though there was no sign of any recent activity. The place looked abandoned, desolate and broken, like much of the rest of Earth. As they approached the base, Rill felt a strange mixture of awe and unease. The humans had lived here. They had endured, not just the environment, but everything it had thrown at them. And they had built something out of it. He couldn't understand how this was possible. It didn't make sense. And yet, here they were, on a planet that could easily crush any alien species that dared to set foot on it. They entered the base cautiously, weapons drawn, and found it eerily quiet. The walls were lined with old equipment, some of it still operational despite the age. But it was the human survivors that caught Rill's attention. They were rugged, tough, and clearly accustomed to surviving in the harsh conditions of Earth. Among them was an older man, one whose face Rill recognized from the stories. Marcus Kane. The very same human Thrazik had spoken of. Marcus was older than Thrazik had described, his features weathered by time and hardship, but the fire in his eyes was unmistakable. He had survived Earth's hellish landscape, had endured more than Rill could comprehend, and yet there was a calmness about him, an aura of authority and experience that was undeniable. "I assume you're here because of the stories," Marcus said, his voice rough but firm. He wasn't surprised to see them. He had known they would come. "Thrazik spoke of you all, didn't he?" Rill nodded, his mind racing. "Yes. We had to see it for ourselves." Marcus studied them for a moment before replying. "You wanted to know if the stories were true. They are. But they don't tell the whole story. Earth is a death world, yes, but it's also a place where survival is possible, if you know how to adapt, how to think. It's not about brute strength or firepower. It's about using your mind to find a way to survive, no matter the odds." Rill was silent for a long moment, processing the gravity of Marcus's words. He had thought he was here to disprove Thrazik's tales, to show that Earth's dangers were no different from the other war zones they had encountered. But now, standing before Marcus Kane, Rill realized that he had underestimated everything. Earth wasn't just a planet filled with dangers, it was a place where survival depended on more than just physical prowess. It depended on something deeper, something that only humans seemed to fully understand. Rill felt a flicker of understanding ignite in his mind. He had come here to test Thrazik's stories, but what he was learning was far more important. He had come here to understand what it truly meant to survive. And Earth was the ultimate teacher. The time Rill and his crew spent on Earth passed in a blur of awe and disbelief. They had come expecting to find a world ripe for confirmation of Thrazik's tales, a place where the human stories would fall apart, where they could prove that humans weren't the superior survivors they were made out to be. Instead, they had uncovered a new truth, one that made everything they thought they knew about survival seem insignificant in comparison. The planet was a wasteland of chaos, its environment a deadly playground for those who had the grit and ingenuity to survive. And somehow, against all odds, humans had done it. They had not just survived, they had thrived. Marcus Kane had shared with them the intricacies of human life on Earth, his experiences with its dangers, and his struggles to overcome the odds. But it wasn't until Rill saw it with his own eyes that the full magnitude of what had been achieved truly sank in. The way humans adapted, how they used the smallest details of their environment to their advantage, was beyond anything Rill had ever experienced. While his species was fast, powerful, and resourceful in their own right, they relied heavily on technology, on weapons and armor, to protect them. Humans, on the other hand, had to rely on their minds, their creativity, and their sheer willpower to make it through the day. And that, Rill now realized, was what made humans so incredibly dangerous. Marcus, with his weathered face and seasoned eyes, had seen it all. From battling wild beasts to surviving extreme weather conditions and learning to hunt in the ruins of the world, he had seen the depths of human resilience. And every time the odds had been stacked against him, he had found a way to outthink and outlast the challenges thrown his way. "It's not about being the strongest," Marcus had said when Rill asked how humans survived. "It's about being the smartest. The world doesn't care about your strength when the ground beneath you is shaking, when the skies open up and flood everything in its path. What matters is how you think, how you adapt." This had struck Rill deeply. It wasn't just Marcus's physical endurance that impressed him, it was his mental toughness. The way he could stay calm under pressure, make quick decisions in the face of danger, and lead others through impossible circumstances was something Rill had never truly appreciated until now. Marcus wasn't just a survivor, he was a master of survival in the truest sense. The more Rill observed, the more he realized that there was something fundamentally different about Earth. It wasn't simply the dangers it posed, but how those dangers shaped the beings who lived there. Earth was a crucible, a forge where only the most adaptable survived. It had been through countless trials, natural and man-made, that the human race had been tempered into something unlike any other species. They didn't just survive, they learned from their mistakes, built upon their experiences, and evolved in ways that no technology or weapon could replicate. One night, as they gathered around a campfire after a long day of exploring the wreckage of what was once a thriving human settlement, Marcus told them another story, a story that Rill would never forget. It was about a time when humans had to make a hard choice, to fight or to survive by running. An enemy force had descended upon them, superior in numbers and weaponry, and the humans had no chance of defeating them in direct combat. But instead of throwing themselves at the enemy, they had retreated into the mountains, into a harsh, unforgiving terrain, using every bit of knowledge they had about the land to stay one step ahead. "We didn't run because we were afraid," Marcus explained, his voice steady despite the weight of the memory. "We ran because we knew that survival meant living to fight another day. We didn't have the strength to match them, but we had the smarts. We knew the land better than they did, and we used it to our advantage." The story left a lasting impression on Rill. The humans had known when to fight and when to retreat, not out of cowardice, but out of wisdom. It was a stark contrast to the way his people operated. They would have fought to the last, thinking that strength and bravery would win the day. But what Marcus and his people understood was something far more profound, that survival wasn't always about brute force. Sometimes it was about knowing when to fight and when to wait, when to strike and when to hide. And it was this fundamental lesson, adaptability, wisdom, and the ability to think on your feet, that Rill began to realize was the true strength of humanity. He had come to Earth expecting to find a weakness, something to disprove Thrazic's stories. Instead, he had found an entirely new kind of strength, one that he had never considered before. But just as Rill began to grasp the enormity of his discovery, the calm atmosphere of their expedition was shattered. A new threat had appeared, one that Rill had never expected. A massive storm system had begun to form on the horizon, growing more violent by the minute. Earth's volatile weather patterns were infamous, and the recruits had already experienced firsthand how dangerous they could be. But this was different. This storm was far beyond anything they had encountered, a superstorm that could devastate everything in its path. Rill and the soldiers, along with Marcus and his group of survivors, hurried to make preparations. They gathered what supplies they could, but they knew it wouldn't be enough. The storm was coming too quickly, and their shelter wasn't designed to withstand such a violent force of nature. As the winds picked up and the rain began to pour, Rill realized the true magnitude of the danger they were facing. Marcus, however, remained calm. "We need to move," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "There's a cave system nearby, one that should be able to shelter us from the worst of the storm. But we'll need to move fast. If we don't, we'll be caught in the open." The group rushed to the cave system, but as they neared the entrance, Rill saw the full extent of the storm's power. The skies were black with clouds, and the winds were so strong that they could barely stand against them. The air was filled with the roar of the storm, and the ground beneath them trembled with each gust. Rill had never seen anything like it. This wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a force of nature that seemed intent on wiping them all out. But even in the face of such overwhelming odds, Marcus remained unfazed. He led the group with purpose, navigating through the dangerous terrain as though he had done it 1,000 times before. They finally reached the cave, just as the storm hit in full force. Inside, they huddled together, their faces grim but relieved. The storm raged outside, but they were safe, at least for now. As they sat in the darkness of the cave, waiting for the storm to pass, Rill couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect for Marcus and the humans. This was what it meant to survive. This was what it meant to be a true warrior, not just to fight, but to endure, to adapt, and to find a way through the storm, no matter how fierce. The storm raged for hours, but when it finally subsided, Rill felt as though something inside him had changed. He had come to Earth seeking to disprove Thrazic's stories, but instead, he had discovered a new truth: survival wasn't about technology or brute force. It was about resilience, resourcefulness, and the ability to adapt to whatever life threw at you. And it was this lesson, this newfound understanding, that would stay with him for the rest of his life. As Rill looked around at his fellow soldiers, at Marcus, and at the survivors who had braved the storm together, he knew that he had found the true meaning of survival. And for the first time since arriving on Earth, he understood why Thrazic had spoken so highly of humans. They weren't just survivors. They were the ultimate survivors. And it was a lesson that Rill would carry with him forever.